This week, a look at Grant Morrison's late 80s run on Animal Man, its religious and spiritual themes, and the patterns it sets for Morrison's later work. I'm joined by Matthew Brake, a professor in the communications department at George Mason University and series editor of the Theology and Pop Culture book series. First, help us reach our goal to unlock a new podcast about the manga Fullmetal Alchemist, The Law of Equivalent Exchange. It's a chapter-by-chapter reading of the manga, with commentary on the translation, including the sound effects, and on how creator Hiromu Arakawa masterfully put together the story of Edward and Alphonse Elric. Patrick and I have already started recording the show, and we can't wait for you to hear it. If you're a fan of Fullmetal Alchemist, one of the best manga of the 21st century, pledge now at patreon.com/deconcomics to hear The Law of Equivalent Exchange. This is Tim.
This is Matt.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo, and I'm talking this time with Matt Brake. I don't remember where you are. Hi, Matt.
Hi, I'm in Fairfax, Virginia.
Okay. So Matt had put out something on Twitter saying he was available to talk about comics and religion on whatever podcast. And I think maybe I saw it because the BGSU account retweeted it. And so I said, what? Somebody's offering podcast content? Okay. About comics? Okay. And so we wrote back and forth for a while trying to figure out exactly what we would talk about. And we ended up settling on Grant Morrison's Animal Man. Now, I've never really been a DC person. I was always a Marvel reader growing up. And so my familiarity with DC is quite shallow, and most of it is stuff that I've picked up since starting this podcast, bits and pieces. And this book, parts of it deal a lot with Crisis of Infinite Earths and characters who disappeared because of it. And, I don't recognize those characters or the changes that were made in some characters because of that, including Animal Man, changes in their continuity and whatever. So I was kind of learning DC history somewhat as I was reading this.
You can't help it when you're dealing with Grant Morrison. It's always a deep cut.
Right. So you brought this book up because you said it was one of the more spiritual comics you've read. So why is that?
So Morrison does a few things throughout his Animal Man run that deals with topics like, and this is how I break it down in my class, and I'm pretty sure I got this from one of the books I based the class that I teach Morrison in out of, but you see a few different things happening in Morrison's work here. You see metaphysics, like he's asking questions about the nature of the universe. Mm-hmm. And some of those questions relate to metafiction, this whole idea of self-aware fiction, mm-hmm. which he starts out really diving into with the Coyote Gospel. Mm-hmm. And then there are a lot of themes there which come back in the last issue, which is famous for Morrison putting on this fiction suit, as he calls it, and interacting with this character he's been writing, right?
Yeah.
All the while, all of that ties into some of his beliefs about the nature of the universe, particularly some of the ones that actually are later fleshed out after he has this spiritual experience at Kathmandu that he sometimes talks about, where he feels like he leaves sort of this earth and sort of sees it from a higher dimension, a higher spatial dimension or whatever, and like looks down at Earth in the same way that we look down at this comic, mm-hmm. right? We see the contours of that entire universe, that story. We can see time, the whole of time, and see it from its beginning and end. There's this old picture that when I teach Augustine, there's this picture in the reader I use that shows kind of this globe that is the earth, but the entire created order, and God standing outside of it measuring it, right? And so there's that sense of looking at the universe and thinking maybe there's a higher perspective from which our entire lives unfold in the same way the stories that we read unfold. And then I start talking about things like, J.R.R. Tolkien and subcreation, because Tolkien has this whole idea, like, I haven't just created a world, I discovered a world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And how much he actually metaphysically believes that, I'm going to put to the side. But I always see sort of these resonances with Morrison, because on the one hand, there's video and audio of him being like, look, man, these things aren't real. It's cool. Like, everyone calm down. But then he also talks about the DC universe and these fictional worlds as being these sort of living, sentient entities that sort of take on a life of their own, and which we can either choose to curate well or editorially destroy. And you see him play around with those ideas in other comics, like Multiversity, the Gentry, or in Final Crisis, the Monitors are bad editors. Right. So yeah, that's why I say it's spiritual, just because of the way it shows the universe as this sort of tiered dimensional space with like a fictional world, a higher fictional world, then our world, and then for Morrison maybe this higher plane of existence. And depending on where you stand religiously, you might have different ways of talking about that.
So the first 4 issues of this, it was meant to be a mini-series originally, and the first 4 issues are just kind of a standard superhero story. And then when they asked him to keep going, then I guess was when he started to hit on the idea of sort of, breaking the fourth wall. And the 5th issue, you mentioned the Coyote Gospel, which even though I've now finished the series, I still don't quite understand the Coyote Gospel. We end up with a character who is basically Wile E. Coyote, but he's also representing Christ in some way, and I just couldn't get over the ridiculousness of that idea. But what do you think of that issue?
Yeah, so for those who haven't read the story, you basically have this situation where this horrifying man coyote appears in the desert, while you have this trucker who's driving along, and he picks up this girl who wants to be a star in Hollywood. And I guess he's sort of religious, or he becomes religious afterwards. He has this cross hanging from his truck or whatever. They go past this his name is Crafty the Coyote instead of Wiley. And what ends up happening, I think it takes place over a year. Like, it turns out, the girl ends up, I think, dying or getting like becoming a sex worker instead of a starlet.
Yeah, I think both of those things happened. Yes.
And so he believes, like, he had this encounter. The trucker believes he had this encounter with the devil in the wilderness, right? Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, he tries to kill. He comes back to try to kill Crafty, creates a silver bullet to kill him. Now, what you find out is, as Animal Man, who plays a very minimal role in the story, and that's sort of a theme Morrison plays with, sort of this anticlimactic bathos where Animal Man is very useless throughout this entire run. And that's sort of that pathetic, anticlimactic mood shift, right? That Morrison just plays with, and then even acknowledges at the end of the story when he's like, yeah, sometimes stories just don't end on the high you think they will.
Well, yeah, and they also talk about, being a spectator more than a participant in your own life.
Yeah. And so we find out that Crafty comes from this fictional world, this lower tier of the universe.
Which is basically Looney Tunes world.
yeah. And so, like, so what ends up happening is Crafty tries to talk to his creator, and he tries to say, "Hey, can you spare my world of its violence?" And he says, that's fine, but you have to live in this other world, the real world that's terrifying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Crafty moves into the real world of Animal Man's world, but he's, Crafty and Animal Man are unintelligible to each other, right?
Right, yeah, Crafty has that whole document written up with his story, and Animal Man can't read it. It just looks like scratchings on paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, but God, quote unquote, who has a brush. What does that mean? So he's kind of set up Krusty, or not Krusty, Crafty to
Krusty the Clown.
Yeah, he set up Crafty to be dying in order to save his world, and dying repeatedly. And Wile E. Coyote dies repeatedly, basically, and then comes back in the next scene, perfectly fine. But here, it's, the same thing kind of happens, but it's more painful for him, and you see his body kind of reassembling itself.
Yeah. Well, and Morrison's doing a couple of things here. He's also critiquing, and you see this happen later on with the post when he's dealing with the Crisis on Infinite Earth stuff. He's sort of critiquing the move towards realism in comics, right?
Yeah.
And so he's sort of playing on the idea of how, like, actually horrifying some of these, like, physical actions are on Crafty's body, right? Like, every time we see Wile E. Coyote get splattered, right? We don't think of, like, brain matter coming out or whatever, but, like... And then, of course, there's, dealing with... It's like the higher up you move in the tiers of reality, the more real things become, but the more violent and unbearable they become.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and you see that at the end of the run, where Morrison, he's this real world figure who's the tones of the real world are muted, and he has this whole discussion about how, we have to give ourselves entertainment, basically because life sort of seems absurd, right? And so he plays on the absurd. He plays on, he talks about, whatever Crafty's God is. He's much more like what, religious scholars would call the Gnostic demiurge, not the loving God, but like the in-between God who created the world of matter and was either incompetent or evil. And with the implication, of course, being that our own world could have been created the same way. And Morrison, of course, will talk about the Christian God in some of his other works specifically. And he sort of paints him as that sort of like a very parasitic, evil, incompetent, Gnostic demiurge who is either incompetent or cruel. And that's sort of what we see in things like Final Crisis and his one series, Nameless, where we see this idea that he paints, and he says it actually in an interview, that, there's this one parasitic idea that infiltrates the world, and he seems to indicate it represents the Christian God, which he sees as one of the worst ideas ever introduced into the history of thought, right? And so he's playing around with a lot of different ideas here, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
And I see you mentioned the violence and the idea that what he dismisses as a bad idea, that this darker, violent world is somehow more adult. But then, and also, they're talking about how when some of the characters start to realize that people are watching them, particularly Psychopirate, who has been dismissed as crazy because he actually understands the truth of what their situation is, that they're just characters in a comic book and people are reading them. But, he says, no, don't fight, because that's what they want to see. They want to see us hurt each other. And so Morrison's kind of calling out the reader there too. Like, you just watching these people hurt each other.
Yeah, you're spectating, man. Yeah, why do we get off on violence as entertainment, right? And there's some Silver Age nostalgia there for, I mean, one of the characters that pops up is like Sunshine Superman is one. You have of course the Crime Syndicate of America shows up. Some of the super pets from back in the Silver Age, like I think Supergirl's horse is there, and like was it Streaky the cat? Like all these really absurd concepts.
Ace the Bat Hound.
Yeah, Ace the Bat Hound. All these concepts that for Morrison, I think he feels like represent potential story ideas that are cut off for, quote, not being realistic enough. And I know for Morrison, like a lot of comparisons are often made between him and Alan Moore, right? And what's interesting is that those first 4 issues are Grant Morrison's Alan Moore impression.
Okay.
Yeah, they're Grant Morrison's Alan Moore.
Yeah, it's his first work for DC, just when DC was recruiting new British writers to see if they were duplicate Alan Moores or something. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess it would make sense that he would be trying to imitate Alan Moore at first.
And he talks about that. He's like, look, I gave them what I thought they wanted. It was an Alan Moore copycat story. But then, of course, yeah, like you said, then he kind of goes off on his own tangent. And, the comparison that's often made is if Alan Moore is trying to bring the real world into comics, Morrison's goal is to bring comics into the real world, like to bring the fantastic into the real world, which is another reason why I like him. Because, I sometimes tell people that my goal when I teach comics and religion is to enchant the world, to make it a place that is imbued with meaning and not just dead matter. Like there's an inherent meaning that can be brought to the world. Now, where people land on that, in my classes, I leave that up to them. I have my own beliefs and answers to those questions. But I think it's important to think of the world as, what is the Shakespeare quote? There are more things in this world than we dare dream, Horatio, or whatever the line is. So I think Morrison helps with that just because he is so fantastical in his writing.
Just on the level of making the comics characters aware of their situation, so when he brings in the what's his name, Dr. Highwater, who he's supposed to be American Indian. I don't know. I know they have to recolor these things when they put them out, but for crying out loud, his skin is pink.
Yes,
that's kind of. At first, I couldn't figure out why it was pink. It took me a while to figure out it was because he was supposed to be American Indian.
Yeah,
but when he first appears, he's kind of disoriented. He doesn't understand why he's there and where he came from, and it's because he's a new character. I thought that was interesting. That normally the characters don't comment on that or like, oh, where did I come from? But in this case, he's kind of puzzled by it. Or they talk about, or Morrison himself in the comic talks about how when they travel, they don't really quite remember the traveling. They're just in the destination place, and it saves time. But
or when they're like, those guys I caught who were about to rape my wife and like killed the mother cat, like
there was no trial.
Yeah, did those guys have a trial? Like, yeah. The Highwater stuff is nuts because like when I started to read through it, the first time I ever read it, and like I caught the gist that he's a Native American, but like the coloring of the skin, I was like, oh man, I don't know if this is problematic. Is this problematic? I'm not. Is this cancelable? I don't understand. And then the Mad Hatter comes afterward and is like, excuse me, Redskin. And I was like, I think I've told my class before, like, see, this is why the Washington Redskins should change their name, because like this feels terrible.
Yeah, no, they finally are. But so his name is kind of interesting. Highwater, is that as in hell or? I wasn't quite. And then later, when he and Animal Man are on the butte in Arizona and tripping out on the peyote, and then for a while there is high water, and they Dr. Highwater actually says that around the butte, so they're on an island. But why do you think he gave the character that name?
Yeah, I would love. Well, there's a lot in that whole sequence. Like I love it. I love the trippiness. I love the whole like I can see you thing.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, there's a full page panel where Animal Man Buddy is looking at the reader, and it's drawn in such a sharp pen that it really sticks out all the more. It's really effective.
I had a there was a girl in one of my classes who was a part of the Secular Student Alliance. So in theory, she should be impervious to being like fooled by an artist, right?
Uh-huh.
And she said she turned the page and she got chills, and I was like, yes, the world is enchanted. Yes. Um, yeah, I don't know. I've wondered in general about because I can't comment on why he chose High Water. And I've wondered about how much research he did on Native American traditions, because the problem here, right, is that something could be appropriated.
Mm-hmm.
But I suspect with Morrison, he tends to be a pretty respectful guy of different traditions. Like he seems to be pretty well read. So my hope is that he chose a name that was, not like what a lot of writers might have done once upon a time. Like, oh, this sounds very Native American. My hope is that he thought about the name, he gave it thought, and I hope that with all of some of the language, the ritual, the tradition, my hope is that he actually did research and wasn't just appropriating.
Mm-hmm.
I actually heard a paper at a conference that was actually about his work on the Invisibles, which is like his magnum opus. Like all the weird stuff here dialed up to 11. And I think they dealt with one of the rituals a trans character goes through. I think the paper said he did it well. I can't remember. So I can't speak to why he chose High Water, whether it was a play on words, whether it was appropriation, whether or not there was some deeper meaning.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, reading this, there are a number of pretty clear references to Christianity. I was wondering what Morrison's religious thought was at the time. Like if he, I mean, I don't know, somehow he didn't strike me as a guy who would be like a traditional Christian, but I was interested in particularly not so much the Wile E. Coyote as Christ, but the Foxy bit, which shows up first in issue 10, and then he repeats it at the very end of the story. And Foxy, the character, shows up on the Butte also. But the idea that when he was a kid, he would see lights flashing from the hill in the distance, which he figures were probably just car headlights, but he thought of it as his this mysterious character Foxy who was signaling him, and his parents gave him a flashlight so he could signal back. And at the very end, well, I could see it coming, but he's flashing his light at the hill again, and nothing's happening. And then after he leaves, then a light flashes from the hill, and I felt like you could interpret that as God is there, but God is kind of acting on his own time. So always be aware of the possibility that he could signal you. I don't know, but I'm not sure if that's what he intended there or not.
Well, I think if we go with the whole death of the author thing, I think one could give it that interpretation depending on their standpoint. Mm-hmm. I know from Morrison, and there's a really great documentary for free that Sequart put out called Talking with Gods, and it goes through Morrison's life and upbringing and the stages in his career up until about, I think, right around a little after the New 52, or around the New 52. I think goes up to about 2010. And one of the things about Morrison is, at the time when he wrote Animal Man, I think he had read things like, Aleister Crowley, and was into some different occultic stuff, the tarot and whatnot. I'm not sure, Alan Moore, there's a timeline with Alan Moore where he goes from an atheist to being a magician. I'm a little unclear on Morrison's timeline. I know this is pre-Kathmandu, which I believe was in 94.
Okay.
And you see that affect his writing in the 90s, where he's basically trying to get people to think about, and you see it in Justice League, particularly Rock of Ages, where he's trying to get people to think about this trippy world and how humans are really superheroes and we're the fifth world as opposed to Jack Kirby's fourth world. Like I said, Morrison has gone on record, and this is in the back of his Nameless, an interview in his Nameless graphic novel, which was an independent work of his, which is very kind of a space horror thing. I want to call it Event Horizon, but it's better than Event Horizon. But he talks about how he thinks the Christian God and the concepts of guilt and all these things are the worst ideas to ever be introduced into human history. But he also reads mystics like Julian of Norwich, who talks about God in feminine terms, and he seems to like that. I know some of his work references this idea of the omega point, that history is leading up to a final growth in the world and the universe that I believe originated with, not just popularized by, a Catholic writer, Teilhard de Chardin, who did a lot of work trying to reconcile Christianity and evolution in the 40s and 50s. And for Chardin, and Chardin flirts with, and this, you see Morrison play around with this, that the world isn't just matter. We can't just look at the world of matter, but, thought also has its own rules and principles, right? And so, and you see that in All-Star Superman. Lex Luthor is looking around and he says, it's consciousness. Consciousness is what holds it together, right? And you see that play out in Morrison's thought. Oftentimes this is a view called panpsychism, this idea that the universe, if you're trying to avoid coming up with any sort of classical theism, but not just simply rely on chance for the creation of the world, panpsychism is an alternative a lot of people turn to. This idea that alongside the world of matter is the world of consciousness, and consciousness is the organizing principle. And so that Morrison believes that, and he relies on different people like physicist David Bohm and his implicate order theory, this idea that for Bohm, trying to reconcile quantum mechanics and relativity, we have to have a different theory to bring it all together. And for Bohm, there's this idea that there's this underlying implicate order that everything unfolds out of. So everything is connected to everything else. The universe mirrors itself. Every part is a part of the whole. Every whole is a part of every part. And these themes repeat themselves throughout Morrison's work, not just in Animal Man, but there's a reason why he chooses Mirror Master, right? Coyote Gospel is in a lot of ways a part that reflects the whole of his entire run, with the themes of metafiction and the sort of tiered reality, the fictionality of all of experience. And so there, and you see, actually, he talks to Buddy at the end, and he says, "Have you ever read David Bohm's Unfolding Meaning?" Which I ended up buying because I was like, "Oh, I should really read this book to understand Morrison."
Coming up, equating permanence with being real, puzzling Christian imagery, connecting themes throughout Morrison's work, and more. In 2008, when we changed from a hard-coded website to a WordPress site, the first 3 years' worth of Deconstructing Comics episodes became unavailable. Thanks to our supporters on Patreon, these classic early episodes have been gradually unlocked, and I've been putting them back on the site in reverse order. This week I'll republish number 47 from October 30th, 2006, in which we discuss tie-in issues to Marvel's Civil War event, Comicraft's Balloon Tales website, and more. Find the classic episodes on our Facebook and Twitter feeds by choosing the earliest months listed in the sidebar pull-down menu at deconstructingcomics.com, in publicly available posts on our Patreon page, or in the Patreon smartphone app. Classic episodes have been unlocked back to number 46, so only one more classic episode will be re-released, unless we meet our next Patreon goal. And you can help us make our Fullmetal Alchemist podcast a reality as well. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics. Tim and Paul race to the scene, where a 1960s Batman TV episode needs analyzing. the show's attitude toward civics,
a loyal taxpayer stooping to criminal methods,
toward women,
a dish,
toward time management.
All in all, Batman, you've been pretty busy.
As well as the history, the casting, and more. Tune in via iTunes or Stitcher, or visit tothebatpoles.libsyn.com for
to the bat poles.
I was just rereading this just before we started. I managed to finish my reread this time. Sometimes I don't. But talking about, so Buddy asks, am I real? Or he's insisting that he's real, and Morrison says, in a way, you're more real than I am because you'll still probably be around and young when I'm old or dead. And I thought that was interesting that he seemed to be tying being real to permanence. So the comic characters are maybe more real because they'll always be around and you can, reactivate their lives just by reading them again.
Yeah, so that's where we start getting into. So another person that often they'll talk about, and not just me. I mean, this isn't original to me. I mean, other people have pointed this out. Mm-hmm. The discussion that one can have about Plato and Grant Morrison, because for the philosopher Plato, for knowledge to be real, for knowledge to be knowledge, it has to be eternal and unchanging. And the only thing that is eternal and unchanging is the world of the forms, of these eternal ideas. And so with Morrison, again, we find sort of some of that playing out, right? Where it's like, Buddy, Superman, these ideas are more real and will affect action in the world long after I've left. And so, that's where we get into Plato and the idea of idealism that comes into play. Mm-hmm. Which also ends up affecting ideas about Gnosticism again. The world of ideas, and then, of course, the demiurge that's the less than, this incompetent and or evil being that creates the world where we all suffer. Mm-hmm. And so all of those ideas are sort of all... And not to mention, too, with Morrison, like, you see it in Doom Patrol, too. Like, some of it he just uses Christian imagery because it's effective, right? Like people, especially largely a quote Western audience, will probably relate to it. It's been popularized. But yeah, as far as the most definitive thing I can say about Morrison's own views is that he is a modern spiritualist and practitioner of sigil magic. Like, that's his big thing. Like you write a word, remove parts of the word, create an image, and then masturbate to that image, and make whatever happen that you want to see happen in the world. So this modern magical spiritual practice that he's involved in, right? Like that's, and he has an essay on it. I think it's called Pop Magic. But that's that, and so I know he's borrowing from different. Not just Christian ideas, but from Egyptology and some various other stuff throughout his work. But because I'm trained as a Christian theologian and religious studies person, like I can see the Christian stuff most clearly in how he plays with it and takes certain things and then leaves certain other things behind.
Mm-hmm. In I don't know about his other work. I mean, I've read bits and pieces of it, but in Animal Man, he also talks a lot about animal rights and vegetarianism. And it was interesting that by his own admission, both in the Volume 1 preface and in the last issue, he realizes that it probably came off as preachy, which I thought so too.
Well, yeah, there's that one issue. And what's funny, I think it's the only issue from this run that I have in first print.
Oh.
I had a student order it by accident in a class and was like, well, I'm not going to keep it. Like, here's I think it's issue 13 or 14.
Is this the dolphin issue?
Yeah, the dolphin issue, which is...
yeah, that's 15, actually.
15, yeah. So I have this issue 15, but, that's largely considered to be a very throwaway story.
Mm-hmm.
Because
I skipped it when I was rereading it.
and that would probably be fine, because most people would say it doesn't really add, at that point, it doesn't add anything to the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically like whaling bad.
Yeah.
Fishing for dolphins bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, we got this.
Right, yeah, I understand that without reading the comics. So
Yeah. Thank you, Grant.
Yeah, it felt too predictable reading it. Like you kind of knew what the message was going to be. You kind of understood what was going to happen. Probably some dolphins would tragically die, and you'd be outraged, or you would be meant to be outraged. But although I had not been aware of this kind of dolphin killing festival on the Faroe Islands, I Googled it to make sure that this was something factual, and indeed it's existed there for a long time.
I didn't know.
And and there's a place in Japan that has something similar, actually. And I've heard about that, but there was a film about that, a documentary. And I know a lot of environmentalists have protested that also. But yeah, well, another place where Christian imagery shows up and just sort of like puzzled me. So in that 2-issue bit where Highwater and Buddy are on the butte and they take the peyote and a lot of things are revealed to them, which then they later wonder if those were real or a dream. But Highwater's his totem is the eagle, and this huge eagle appears, and then it starts raining eagle blood, and the narration says, "This is my body, this is my blood." So invoking communion from Christian Church, and I was kind of surprised that showed up there. Do you have a take on that?
I don't. I oftentimes will point to it as like, oh, this is him using Christian imagery in this sort of Dadaist way. But I think it's just that. I think it's much like the Dadaist, where they would take these everyday images and compile them together. Mm-hmm. I think that's what you see a lot, particularly in Doom Patrol. And I think it's something similar here. Like I'd have to interview Grant, to find out or whatever. But I'm not sure. I think it's more meant to just be evocative imagery. I'm not sure it's meant to. Trying to see if I can see it now, because I know the exact part you're talking about, and I've always tried to think about it and come up with an answer that, yeah, here it is. This is my body. This is my blood. Yeah, I kind of get the impression that it's meant to be evocative and is just sort of using the imagery. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't have any take beyond that. Like okay. I've tried to be like, is it because they were doing the peyote? The peyote together? Is it because like he's participating in the energies of his ancestors? But I got nothing.
Okay. And I realized reading it the second time, so, Buddy, his family gets killed. And at one point he goes back in time, or attempts to kind of go back in time. The machine is kind of broken and it doesn't work very well. They can't see him. But he wants to try to warn his family about what's coming. And eventually, then he ends up getting transported back to the 60s, and he's talking with these other characters who are kind of philosopher types or eternal. They're characters who can't die, and they kind of help him to work through his grief, and he's getting to understand his powers and the world and the fact that he's a character. Okay, I guess I'm getting two things confused here. Sorry.
So you're talking about the 60? Yeah, when he goes back and he's talking to it's Phantom Stranger, mm-hmm. Jason Blood, and yeah, there's one or two others.
So as he's kind of accepting, working through his grief there and letting go of the people, of his grief, basically. Meanwhile, in the present, Psychopirate is bringing back all the people who died because of Crisis of Infinite Earths.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of an interesting contrast, where one is, letting go of the past and people who died, where somebody else is bringing them all back to life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting juxtaposition I hadn't thought about before. But it is interesting that while Buddy's having that conversation, I forget which character it is, but there's that quote. Here it is. Life goes on. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Right? And that's sort of a theme like that. And that's Morrison very much using, again, another biblical concept, right? The sort of New Testament teaching about death. The last enemy to be defeated is death. Death, where is your sting? That type of thing. So on the one hand, it is interesting that he's having that conversation with those characters, while these other characters are getting brought back, and in some ways being brought back to life in a very "Oh, death, where is your sting?" mentality. And then at the end, we do see Morrison even do what can only be done in a comic book, except for maybe, and I say this as a Christian, except for maybe one time, his family comes back from the dead. You know what I mean?
even after he's dismissed, the idea of it was all a dream, that went out with the ark, I think he says, and then he goes ahead and does it anyway.
Yeah.
But that kind of plays with the reader's expectations too, because when the family gets killed, you just don't see how that could be left to stand. It was so tragic, and then Morrison is telling you, nope, not going to bring him back, and then he does.
Well, and it's funny because, with Morrison's whole mentality is this anticlimactic, pathetic, this anticlimactic mood, where, as he would point out, it's only in fiction that the impossible can happen, and so. Buddy gets his family back basically with a wish upon a star. Not really. That never actually happened. He doesn't wish upon a star, but it happens just magically because the quote-unquote universe allows it. In the same way that when he does Final Crisis years later, Superman saves the day by wishing for a happy ending. Right? And again, this is where, if you look at Morrison's work, I can't remember which writer commented on this, that I frequently use and borrow from, but going back to that whole David Bohm everything's connected thing, if you look at Morrison's work, you see these connecting threads throughout, these connecting themes, these connecting ideas, whether it's the ending that is just the ending, the happy ending that one wishes for, things about the nature of evil and some of his other work, of course, all the metafictional stuff. Everything and almost everything mirrors everything else. And you see that again with this, how Buddy's family is brought back. He gets a happy ending because in fiction that can happen.
Well, and that's a little bit related to the thing. Well, I think it happens in the early on, that crossover issue with the event. What was it? Invasion. And then there's a callback to it later on where, there's a bomb and all you have to do is turn it off.
Yeah.
Which I guess I took that to be sort of an idea of, it's, dealing with your problems, dealing with grief, just kind of moving on from it and not letting it be there like a ticking time bomb.
It could be that. I'm thinking it has more to do with Morrison's overall, again, this word which I now use, and I'll probably use it till people get annoyed with me using it, and then I'll stop. But bathos, right? It creates this anticlimactic, all you had to do was why were you worried? You just had to turn it off. Oh.
Yeah, it is anticlimactic for sure. It's not very dramatic. It's kind of a gag at the end of that crossover event issue where, I think Hawkman says all you need to do is turn it off. Now, on some maybe less spiritual issues, so before Buddy goes back in time, he kills the people who were responsible for killing his family, and I was surprised at that. I wonder if these issues were Comics Code approved. And they don't reproduce the Comics Code thing in the trade paperback, I don't think. Regardless, I didn't see any code on the cover of that one. I didn't think to look at the other ones.
Yeah, I'd have to go. Actually, I should, if I could dig through my box.
I'd have to look at the original issues.
Although by this time, I believe by the time Animal Man came out, like Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, like other than like I think it was the issue where Harry Osborn does drugs in the 70s.
Right. Well, I know that one did not have code approval.
But then it was actually in the early 80s with Alan Moore where Swamp Thing became, I think, the first regular comic to stop having the Comics Code.
You're right. I remember that now.
And then, of course, Animal Man became a part of the Vertigo line. Like, I'm not sure if it was originally that, because even Neil Gaiman's Sandman wasn't that. But, you had these more adult, the adult-themed, mature readers, British Invader written comics coming out. So I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't.
Yeah, possibly not. So when Buddy goes back in time, then we get some explanations for some things that we saw in earlier issues when he was there and we didn't understand what was happening. But one thing that was never explained, as far as I could tell, I might have missed it. In issue 10, there's a scene where suddenly a lawnmower goes flying through the air, like as if somebody's thrown it. And the second time through, I was watching to see if, like, time-traveling Buddy ever threw a lawnmower, but I didn't see anything like that. So I did not understand that scene in issue 10.
Issue 10, you say?
Yeah.
Do you remember the page?
Yeah, it's near the end. There's a page, it starts out with a blue picket fence. It's a completely silent page. And there's a dog lying in the grass in the foreground. And, something breaks through the fence. I didn't notice that before. Something breaks through the fence, and then in the last panel, the lawnmower is flying through the air.
Yeah, I see now. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Is this an unexplainable occurrence, Morrison? Or could it be from the... I wonder if it's from these things. When Vixen and Animal Man get attacked.
Oh, that must be it. Yeah, those invisible wolf things. Yeah. That has to be it. But yeah, there are places where, he doesn't help you understand some things. Like at another point where his wife briefly disappears, and she's reverted back to pre-crisis continuity where they don't have kids, and then she also disappears, and I figured out the second time that it was because of what was going on with the aliens, where they were doing something. I couldn't quite figure it out, something about fixing the timeline, but because the scene of her disappearing is not adjacent to a scene with the aliens, it's hard to make that connection.
Yeah, I can see that, but yeah, that's definitely a part of that whole alien abduction, which is another thing you sometimes hear Morrison, especially when it describes his Kathmandu thing. He's like, maybe it was aliens. But yeah, you see these aliens, trying to fix all the continuity, and it runs alongside this Vixen story, and with the ape villain. I forget his name because it's not terribly important to me.
Oh, Buona Beast?
Not Buona Beast. It's like this white ape villain who gets erased Remember when you see him get erased?
Oh,
and
that
he's like,
guy, with the Arabic name. Yeah, I don't quite remember what his name was, but yeah, we'll just get rid of him.
Yeah.
Just eliminate him from the story.
But yeah, that there's definitely a lot happening there, and I agree with you. There's a lot Morrison does in this entire run, where he doesn't always help the reader. And I'd be curious to see, because there are times where it's like if Alan Moore does something complicated, you kind of know that there's this artistic, like, smart Alan Moore is being smart Alan Moore.
Mm-hmm.
But I always get the sense with Grant Morrison that, like, I feel like he's not trying to, like, I feel like he is trying to get his readers to think, but I feel like he doesn't want to be, like, a jerk about it. You know what I mean? Like, although I've heard Alan Moore is actually a really nice guy, and I think his cantankerous reputation probably comes from his fallout with DC. But I also know it sounds like him and Morrison didn't get along, and that he was a little persnickety towards Morrison. But I don't know. When I think about the history of philosophy, I think about Kierkegaard and Hegel, and I'm like, oh, is Morrison Kierkegaard to Moore's Hegel? Because Kierkegaard didn't like Hegel very much. Or at least the Danish Hegel. And that's not important. What is important is that, yeah, I wonder why if he's trying to be obscure, or he's trying to be clever, or if it's just the fact that, like, that's the nature of his absurdist tone. Like, it's inherently absurdist, and so it's going to feel not even just anticlimactic, but non-linear, and or if he's thinking about people who will read the trade.
Well, yeah, although at the time this came out, trades didn't really exist in the way they do now. Trades were just kind of getting started, and it was just, the big stuff like Watchmen. This
was the 80s. Well, yeah, all right. The 80s,
this is 1988 to 90, I guess, was the part of the run that was him. Then the series continued on under somebody else up to, like, the mid-90s, but... Right, yeah, I mean, you tell younger comics readers that now, if there are any younger comics readers, like, we didn't have trades then. You had to go to the comic store and search through the long boxes to see if maybe you could find it, or order it by mail.
And then, of course, you always had to worry about if it was too expensive. And then it's like, well, how will I read this classic story?
Yeah, Fantastic Four #1. Nope, I don't have that kind of money, even, in the 80s.
Unless you got, like, I know in the 90s they had Marvel Masterworks. So, like, I think I have the first 30 issues in hardcover from the Masterworks collection. But, yeah, I could definitely see where Morrison, he's created a complex plot, but I think it holds together because he, like, even when he plants his future self in the past issues, like, that's a pretty long way to go if you're planting yourself in issue 8. And not giving the reveal to issue, like, 22 or whatever it was. Like, there's some craft that goes into that.
Yeah, the series, I mean, you have to read it a second time, I think. It's one of those things where you just don't understand everything the first time through. Because, yeah, he's setting up, even his last issue 26, as early as issue 5.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of people feel that way about Morrison. Like, I know, again, I didn't at first like it. I like it now that I've reread it. Final Crisis, which I remember I had a mutual friend who hooked me up with a lunch with a former DC editor guy who was like, I don't understand Final Crisis. And I was like, oh, dude, no, it's so simple. Like, well, it's not simple, but it's no, here's what he's doing. And he's commenting, on editors and the story world. And, he's drawing back to his previous work.
And that was Morrison also.
Yeah, that was Morrison too.
Okay. Remember, I'm not a DC guy.
Yeah. And I want to say, I when I was younger, DC was what I got into just because my dad had all, like, these Silver Age comics.
Oh.
And then the death of Superman happened and Nightfall. But then I switched and got more into, like, Spider-Man and X-Men. And I, like, during the age of Onslaught in the Clone Saga. That was when I got into comics, like the worst time to get into comics. So I definitely, but what brought me back was Batman, and so yeah, DC's become my good. But the one time I will say I'll jump into Marvel World is when Jonathan Hickman writes anything. Then I'll jump, because he's almost like the Marvel Grant Morrison.
Okay, interesting.
But not. He is very different, but...
Yeah, I read his Fantastic Four all the way through. A few of those issues were pretty tough to get through. He had a couple issues there where that it was all this kind of backstory where the FF didn't appear at all. That was... those were kind of tough reads. But yeah, overall, I thought it was pretty good.
Although Al Ewing may actually come closer in his Ultimates run that he did around the Hydra Cap time. Like he played around with some pretty cool ideas in his Ultimates run. That also made me think, okay, maybe this guy is Marvel Grant Morrison.
Okay. So is there anything else we need to get to in Animal Man?
As far as we talked about how that beginning part. I mean, we even kind of touched on the way you occasionally get the outer, because there are a few times where you have like outside of Morrison's run, like the Justice League appears, right? You have the Invasion crossover, you have the Justice League Europe occasionally showing up, but they're sort of very tangential to the plot. In fact, do you remember the issue at the beginning where Superman shows up?
Yeah, he just kind of does a cameo, like, hi, I was just passing by. Oh, sorry, gotta go. It serves no story purpose at all.
And apparently what's happening there is that Morrison is playing around with the idea of the cameo as being silly.
Okay.
And so apparently that's intentional. But yeah, other than that, we could always do a deep dive on, the crisis elements at the end with Psycho Pirate. Then again, that's, with that part, again, Morrison's in some ways critiquing Crisis on Infinite Earths for removing all those characters and ideas. And then, of course, there's the issue. What did you think of the issue where, like, Morrison is talking to Buddy? Was that something you read and it was like, okay, this is neat? Or was it more like, was it that, because I feel like that it would be very easy to read that for the first time and be like, this is so contrived.
No, I found it pretty amusing, actually. And, where he sets up Buddy to fight these other two guys so that he can stand there and give, thanks to people who worked with him on the book. Yeah, I thought that was funny.
I'd like to thank Karen Berger.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, if you don't have any more questions, I don't have,
I have one more little question. So, in the issue with, what's the guy? The guy who has the death touch, Red something. And he's kind of old and he's thinking about killing himself, jumping off a building, and eventually he does and splatters on the ground, and Buddy's flying away, and then in the last page it's a full page of Buddy in the sky, but it's kind of turned negative, the white and black, and that was never really explained. It's never referred back to.
So I that was one thing I looked up. So what that is that in the Invasion crossover, a gene bomb was set off.
Oh, that's when the gene bomb happens. Okay.
Yeah, and so that's when you see him dealing with the after effects of that after in the following issues.
Following issue, yeah.
Yeah, how his powers are so off the fritz, and I'm trying to think. I'm trying to remember because I know that Gaiman, I might be mixing it up with Gaiman, because I know when Gaiman did Sandman, I think in hindsight he regretted having the Justice League appear at the beginning, because he liked having Sandman be off in its own little corner. I'm trying to think what Morrison, because like it is kind of amazing that his run remains as self-contained as it does. But there are ways in which it is mildly affected by editorial mandate that there be a crossover.
Yeah.
But even then, in that issue, you see that anticlimactic thing. He talks to the villain instead of punching him, and then it ends with Buddy being useless, which I've thought about doing when next time I teach on this, talking about like ideas of nonviolence, because Buddy adopts them, and then they end up being useless. But then he adopts violence, and his life goes to hell.
Yeah.
And playing around with that idea, but yeah, that was the Gene Bomb.
Okay. And I'm wondering now. I saw somewhere that there was some kind of special that happened also. I'm wondering if the appearance in this book that issue 10 is double length, if that's actually that they included that special also. But I don't see anything. Okay, here we go. Secret Origins 39 it is included, so that's why. But there's no cover, so it looks as if issue 10 is double sized. But actually, that must be the Secret Origins issue. Okay, yeah. Just in case anybody who knows DC better than I do is yelling at their podcast player, I want to make that clear.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been good. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. Any opportunity to talk about Grant Morrison.
Okay. Animal Man is published by DC. Matt Brake can be reached at popandtheology@gmail.com or check out his website, popcultureandtheology.com. Support this and all of our shows by joining us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics for more details. You can also help us out by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. Do your shopping at deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon so that we get a percentage of the sale. Subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. Increasing our number of subscribers helps a lot, and you'll get our episodes automatically every week. We also hope you'll share your favorite DCP episodes on your social media. We appreciate your support in bringing Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Polls to a larger audience. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week on Deconstructing Comics, the problems of being a comics freelancer, from rights to your work, healthcare, and time management, to female freelancers being taken advantage of by more powerful male creators. I'll talk to Asher Elbine about his recent article in the Daily Beast, titled Inside the Comic Book Industry's Sexual Misconduct Crisis and the Ugly Exploitative History That Got It Here, regarding the recent accusations against Warren Ellis and others. I'll also be talking with artist Howard Simpson about the issues he's faced as a freelancer. That's next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.